יפה, תודה. אז ערב טוב, קוראים לי יהושע פוקס, והערב אני אדבר בלועזית לטובת אורחים וגם כמה אנשים מגוגל וגם מפרייטוס שביקשו לשמוע את ההרצאה הזאת, הראשונה בעולם בנושא הזה. So we're going to switch to English, and tonight I'm going to talk to you about the Google Application Engine Flexible Environment, moving beyond the bounds of PaaS. Tonight, I want you to come away with clues for choosing your cloud layer. We have time to talk in half an hour, so there's plenty of time for questions as well. As you navigate between IaaS and PaaS, it is hard enough to choose, but the layers are multiplying and going beyond just those two layers. So it's not just, in Google terms, GCE and GAE, Google Compute Engine and Google Application Engine, but we also have GKE, Google Container Engine for Docker. And we have cloud functions and data flow for specialized work processes. You can call those PaaSes if you want, whatever you call them, they're a different layer. But now, within Google Application Engine, we have something called the Flexible Environment, added on to the old Standard Environment. A few words about me. I'm just an ordinary guy. I'm not a Googler. I'm not an expert on these things. But my team is implementing with Flexible Environment. And so I think it's an interesting case study. I built this talk for me a year ago. So a year ago I knew about the cloud. As you'll hear in a minute, I knew some things. But of course, the purpose of this talk is to teach you what I learned. We at Freightos are moving fast together with Google. We're in close contact with them, with their core engineers, with their product managers. I really thank some of the people at Google for making their comments on this material, although any botches, fumbles, and mistakes are only mine. So it's really amazing that they're working with me on this, which means, by the way, that we're probably some pretty advanced users that are spending the time on that. They are moving ahead fast, and we're moving ahead fast with them. In the past, I got my start in the cloud with Heroku and Ruby on Rails, a classical PaaS. I've used Amazon EC2, which is their IaaS, infrastructure as a service. And also their Spark service, which if you want, you can call that a platform as a service. That was Python work. But my current work at Freightos is all on the Google Cloud Platform. It's almost entirely Google App Engine with a little bit of GCE, and it's all Java. So this presentation will be about Java. When I talk about strengths and weaknesses, you might say, it works so much better in Python. Well, maybe, but this focus is on Java. Freightos was a very early adopter of Flexible Environment. So we started with Standard Environment, and then we moved to something called Managed VMs. When it first came out, that was an early version of Flexible Environment. We were really among the first, but now, Flexible Environment is in general availability, and we are the first. I really think the first to move to that. Freightos is a marketplace for shipping. So if you want your gigantic container shipped from Shanghai to Norfolk, Virginia, you type in your request here and click, and we run some fancy algorithms to figure out the least expensive and the fastest route for your container on a truck, on a ship, on an airplane. And this has some very special cloud development requirements. We're not the only ones in the world to do this. Waze does something very similar. So do many airplane ticket companies, like Expedia, Kayak, or whatever. But this is not your average application. PaaS starts out as an all-included layer. So Google Application Engine started 10 years ago, before there was even a Google Cloud Platform, as Google's specialty. This was their focus, their first offering on the cloud. It offers lots of out-of-the-box goodness. Convenient APIs, the data store, which is the Google proprietary NoSQL, BigQuery for data warehousing, queues, and a lot more. They also handle the ops infrastructure for you. You don't have to worry about scaling, load balancing, versioning, operating system updates, a nice GUI for managing it all, and much, much more. This is built on a proprietary sandbox. So you might think Docker container, but it actually predates that. And everything is bundled up together. In fact, there's a little piece of data store right there, living in application, shoulder to shoulder with your Java code. They even take a replica of data locally as a sort of cache. That has some pluses and some minuses, as you'll see soon. Your sandbox does communicate with other things, let's say with Cloud SQL. Data store is naturally a distributed database, so it doesn't live entirely inside your little application. There's a lot of functionality right there bundled up. And this puts some limits on your application code. This is the Google Application Standard Environment. It has incredible scalability, security, a lot of good stuff. But they do that by requiring it to use no more than a gigabyte of memory, actually less, but you can configure a gig. They will spin up more copies, more instances, but also shut them down. You have no control. Your application can die at any moment. Your instance can die at any moment. You have to respond within 60 seconds to an HTTP request. 61 seconds, they shut it down. You also have to start up in 60 seconds, initialization of a normal web request. The threads can only live that long. You can't start a thread and then continue running after the HTTP request. You can't run binaries like FFmpeg for image processing. And you can only use some standard Java library classes. In fact, it's not even a blacklist. You are forbidden to use files, sockets, and thread factory, but there's actually a specific whitelist of Java classes you're allowed to use in the standard Google Application Engine. In order to do this, they set up a special JVM for you. They actually modified the Java virtual machine, which is why they only support Java 7, even though Java 8 came out in March 2014, 3 years ago. Although they are supporting it now in alpha. They are moving it. Remember what I said about moving fast? They are supporting that in alpha. All this is built to support one use case, web apps. Web apps for humans, web apps for other applications through APIs, and this puts the architectural limits in your application code. You can do more. For example, you can offload an asynchronous task over task queues and let it run for more than 60 seconds, but the heart of your application would better be a pretty standard web app. Talking about PaaSes, that's not the only flow. For example, for pipelines, you might use Google MapReduce or Dataflow, which is their new thing. And each one has its own way of flowing the data, but these two impose architectural limits on your code that you write. There are two kinds of PaaSes, bundled and unbundled. One is called the all-inclusive resort. That's when you pay for the resort, they give you all the food and everything else. Well, Google Application Standard Environment is like that. Everything is bundled, ready to go. But another kind is a la carte. And that's where it has the same services, but it's not bundled there for you. It's a little less convenient. AWS has been taking this strategy, and now Google is moving in that direction for their future. So that was PaaS. Let's talk a little bit about IaaS. Infrastructure as a service. Google Compute Engine, GCE, is just virtual machines, the operating system layer. Google Container Engine, GKE. K is for container. That's because they already use the C for compute. But it's also for Kubernetes, which is what helps them manage the Docker. So these are a lower layer than platform as a service. Question, when should you choose PaaS, and when should you go beyond that? Choose a PaaS when your application is right up the alley for that PaaS's assumptions. For example, web apps for standard environment. But applications change all the time. That, by the way, is rock cake. You notice the cake theme? Do you have rock solid discipline to keep your application in line? Or, if your application has to go beyond the memory limits, the 60 seconds, can you offload that on a microservice and not let your application grow out of control? But eventually you hit a wall. As one of the fine people at Google said, I never used a PaaS which didn't eventually let me down. Because you do push these limits. You need to use a binary. You need to access sockets. Why might you push the limits? Well, the first bad reason is your design got out of line. You started clogging up memory, holding huge data structures in memory, or your application is just so slow because you didn't optimize it. So it takes 61 seconds, bam. And you just, bad code, bad design. But you know what? Maybe that's not so bad. Maybe in your use case, your users can wait 61 seconds or more. Maybe you're willing to pay the money, and it does cost money, for more than a gigabyte, because, hey, you've got to rush ahead and keep the customers happy. So yes, your application can sometimes grow to require sockets, files, memory, time, whatever it is. But the other reason for going beyond the limits is maybe a better one, which is that you have special requirements requiring special architecture. And when you need an idiosyncratic architecture, go for IaaS or flexible environment. These are not either or. I recommend a microservice architecture with the front-end web app and the back-end, which might be flexible environment. Although remember, if the problem is that your application just grew and started glomming on the memory, that's not what we're talking about. But yes, microservices are good. So what is Flex? Flex breaks out of the limits. You can take more than 60 seconds to initialize or answer a request. Use any classes in the Java virtual machine. Let the thread run as long as you want. However, and this is the big however, it is not compatible with standard environment. That means it does not support those APIs I mentioned to you earlier. Remember, it's a data store, queues. There is a way to use those things. I'll talk about that later. But this is the big difference. So really, flexible environment resembles IaaS in many ways. It's sort of the same use cases. There's no support for the built-in APIs, as in standard, so that's more like a IaaS. And there's no sandbox limitations like a IaaS. On the other hand, it still is a PaaS because it does so much for you. Auto-scaling, automatically updating the operating system every week, relocating between zones, versions, so when you do A/B testing, you have version 1, version 2, or release canary, a management console, a nice GUI, they handle the SSL for you. Your application authenticates against data store with the built-in credentials. You don't have to mess around with SSH keys or I don't know, that sort of thing. Load balancing, traffic splitting, built-in Jetty. Now you might say, Jetty? I can run Jetty myself. It's a web server. But the thing is that they just make it convenient, that's all. Let's compare the three, just to make it clear. Standard environment offers you bundled management of all these layers. The network layer, that's load balancing, etc. The operating system layer, you don't even know what it's running on. Probably Ubuntu, but I don't even know. And APIs to services, they just give you a nice API to data store, etc. The other layers do not give you all these things. Now, for example, flexible environment gives you the network layer and the operating system layer. You don't have to take care of that. But you have to make a little more effort on the APIs. Of course you can invoke the APIs, they just don't make it as convenient. And IaaS, like GKE or GCE, doesn't manage any of these for you. Again, there are wonderful tools in GKE, of course you can do all this stuff, obviously. Bundled tools, easy tools, etc. But you have to think about it a little bit more. There's this continuum between PaaS and IaaS based on how bundled something is. So on the far side, you have the old-fashioned GCE and the old-fashioned Google Application Standard Environment. But Google Container Engine just does a little bit more for you. And Flex does even more for you. But I'm going to talk in a minute about the old Flex. This is interesting. How they had to make this decision, this transition. Even the people at Google had to kind of move up and down the stack to make up their minds. And then the long-term future of standard environment, which I'm not an expert on because I'm not a product manager, but clearly it is less bundled than the standard environment today. More decoupled, we'll talk about that. Yes?
Can I ask questions?
Yeah, let's ask a couple of questions.
So I'm not sure this continuum is right.
Yes.
It's not more or less out of the box. It's more or less the developer wish to learn
Yes.
about the system. Because JPE gives you everything you can
Yes.
get with just flexible VMs.
Good. Okay, good. So you're making an important point that anything can be done in any of these. And because many of these requirements are standard, load balancing, traffic splitting, there are easy ways to do anything in any layer you choose. Flex just gives you one way, out of the box and documented. Maybe makes it
So
easier.
what I mean, if you come from DigitalOcean, BBC background, that's what. So it's easier to use flexible environment versus learning JPE.
I see. Okay, very good. So that's the advantage of flexible environment, that it's more like a PaaS. And you might transfer the skills from other PaaSes that you know. Why might you choose Flex over standard? So first of all, if you need a lot of memory, 200 gigabytes, even 400, they're just coming out with that. Why? Well, maybe you need to pre-cache language translation strings. Let's say you have far more than you can fit into a memcache. And another use case is if you're running complex in-memory mathematical or graph traversal algorithms that need to have all the data right there for you. You have no time to query it out of the database. But these aren't caching. These are both caching. The point of truth is still data store, the underlying backing layer. And when you have this enormous memory, you're going to have to use manual scaling instead of auto-scaling, because just to load up that cache is going to take a long time. It's it's not fast enough to be scaled up and down automatically. You could do it. You could say, I'm only going to fill my cache on a cache miss, and then I can initialize fast and fill up my cache after the fact. But realistically, if you have to cache 200 gigs of anything, you're just going to get going and pre-cache it. After all, that's the point. Another use case of Flex is your own Docker. It is Docker. Flex runs in Docker. So you can customize the JVM parameters. You can use an otherwise unsupported language, Swift, Perl, go wild. Remember, you have control of the layer between the network and the operating system. It's Docker. You can customize the shape with CPU or memory as you choose, as opposed to the more bundled solution of the standard environment. Also, I said you can make your own Docker container, but realistically, you're probably going to use the one they provide you out of the box. And they provide many more options. Python, Java, Node, much more. And more up-to-date versions, Java 8. Whereas standard only supports older Java 7, for the reason I told you earlier, because they've got to rewrite the virtual machine. So you have a lot more Docker containers out of the box that the good folks at Google put together for you. And if you have to use binaries, you can have MPEG. But there can also be reasons for using standard. Flex isn't for everyone. First of all, if your design is standard, you're making a web app, it's just more convenient. And remember, most of us are not special. We're building business-oriented web apps. If whatever the web app is for, selling cake, whatever the theme is, just go with the standard solution. Also, standard is better for spiking traffic because it has process-level instances. Remember the sandbox I told you? That's actually a process, not a Docker. Whereas Flex has hypervisor level. You might have caught the thing there. I said hypervisor level, whereas it's Docker. I'll talk about that in a moment. But in any case, it's the VM layer, much slower. So standard's good for spiky traffic, but Flex is good for consistent traffic or predictably and slowly changing traffic. A word about the history of Flex. Now, if you're about to choose one of these, this does not interest you, because this is old. But I think the point of my lecture is not just to be documentation that you can read online. It's to give an insight into these different layers and levels of the cloud as we go beyond IaaS and PaaS. So they start out with something called managed VMs to escape the limitations of the sandbox. They gave the same APIs for data store and task queues and so on. And it was built as an emulator of standard environment. When I first heard this history, I thought that they just loosened up the standard environment. Now let's say you want to scale an application from one request a second to 20,000. So you go into your Java code, there's a constant 1. You change that to 20,000 and recompile, right? That was a joke. Anyway, so they did not do that. You cannot do that. In fact, they built an emulator because you cannot simply loosen up and make your thing magically different and break the assumptions. And you really cannot break the assumptions. This was built as one Docker container on a GCE virtual machine. You might ask, why only one? What's the point? Docker allows you to have multiple containers on one VM. But it's just a convenient bundling and packaging format. And this is just not Kubernetes. So it's a different way of managing Docker that is not Kubernetes. But all this never went to GA. They've tried for 5.9 compatibility, which means you use the same APIs, but they found it impossible to ignore the underlying architectural assumptions. They had to take a different path. A word about names in case you could get confused by the documentation. This was first called Managed VMs. They changed it to a cooler name, Flexible Environment, which was beta. But then when they moved to the new version, they had to give a name to the old one. So they call it Compat, because it's compatible with APIs. The new one was just called Flexible Environment. So the new Flexible Environment was released in March. And it's different from Managed VMs in standard because it does not support these APIs. Still one Docker, not exactly one Docker. There are also sidecars such as Nginx Proxy or Fluentd for logging and so on. A word about those APIs. You can still do almost everything in the new Flexible Environment using new APIs based on RPC, actually gRPC, which is Google's new variant on that. Mostly what are called the cloud APIs, or, I'll talk in a minute about this, the older client APIs. Sorry about the names, people. It's all clients. Of course you're a client. And of course it's the cloud. But these are just the names that they chose for these different APIs. And you can still use raw RPC, which means you just do a post or a get. So let's talk about those. You can just do a URL very hard to use, and thankfully you never have to do that. You can use auto-generated wrappers called the client. That's where they took the RPC schemas, definitions, and just made it relatively easy to access using Java or Python. It's not hard, but the people at Google have been developing new custom-coded wrappers called the Cloud API. It's okay. It's easy to use. So the fact that you can no longer use the easiest APIs, which are the bundle ones, is not really a problem. These APIs are at different levels of maturity. So as you move to flexible environment, you'll have a general available API for data store, which is really the most important thing, I think. But alpha APIs for some other things, like Memcache or Cloud Test. I recommend that if you're considering Flex, go with the GA. Alphas are always hard to use. But they are working on those fast, and they'll be coming out with those very soon. There's also other APIs, such as the M API, which is just an older generation. That's fine, it's generally available. And then there's some that are not available, like Blob Store. There's no replacement for that. Blob Store is actually an old technology which Google is phasing out, although it's not officially deprecated. The new APIs are built in a decoupled way, and this is the future of the standard environment. You can use them from anywhere, from flexible environments. Go to standard environment, use them there. Google's container engine, compute engine, even from your laptop, which is totally outside of the Google Cloud Platform. So this is the future. In fact, I recommend that you just use the cloud APIs everywhere you can, so you only have to implement once. Yes, there's a question.
I'm not completely sure why they insist on supporting all the Google Application Environment APIs when you can use newer, more standardized GCP APIs.
Well, so the question is why are they supporting old APIs when we've got new ones? Because a lot of us have written code in the old APIs, and they're robust, they're generally available.
The standard environment, Google App Engine, standard environment, it isn't deprecated yet.
It is not.
So run your code there. You don't have to migrate to Flex Env.
You ask why can we not just write all our code for standard environment? Because flexible environment provides more functionality that we described, no? Flexible environment provides some abilities that standard does not. As I mentioned earlier.
No, if you wanted to migrate,
yes.
You can migrate to GCE and
so,
use newer standard GCP. So,
yes.
So it's like a middle ground. You migrating from standard Google App Engine to the Flex Env, but you still insist on using older version of APIs.
Well, okay. So what I'm talking about here is migrating from possibly, if you have an application in a standard environment, migrating to the new APIs unflexible. If that meets your requirements, and that's the only way to meet your requirement, you might want to do that. If you're developing something new, you do not, and if you choose either standard or flex, you can just use the new APIs. If you're coding something new from scratch, you ask, why might I not simply go straight to GCE? Well, Flex provides some benefits, like it manages auto-scaling, there's a convenient deployment tools, and a lot more. So there are reasons not to go straight to the infrastructure as a service. These are all choices, though, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on, like why you might actually want to go straight for the IaaS. Okay, so migration. If you do have an existing code base in standard environment, you can keep running it in standard environment. But if you do choose to migrate, you can do that. Mostly, the new APIs have the same semantics, just a different syntax. So they do all the same things. If you're going to query an object from the data store, it's just the same behavior. Some semantics are missing. For example, if you want to count the entities, you have to code that yourself. And there's some immaturity, as I mentioned earlier. Some of the APIs are in alpha, some are generally available. Important message. On the cloud, you must keep moving. This is not Google, this is not Amazon, it's not Azure. You have to keep moving on the cloud, because if you're writing an application for a bank in COBOL in 1960, you can keep running the same application until 2017. You may have to bring your developers out of retirement, but of course people do that. But with the cloud, your provider is going to replace your infrastructure all the time. This is, again, true about everything in the cloud, although differently so for different levels of product. So it's just something to think about, that there's going to be deprecation, just as there is in all software, and Google is going to be pointing you to beta libraries. You're going to say, go to this, and you're going to say it's beta, and they're going to say, yes, but we're rushing forward with that, and we're fixing bugs and developing that. So this is just a fun fact about living in the cloud.
No, that's not relevant to AWS, that's more relevant to GCP, because in AWS, you still can launch instances.
Yes.
Nobody knows this. Those
Yes.
types of instances ever existed.
Yes.
I'm using AWS since 2006,
Yes.
and
Yep.
many services are still available, even that you can find documentation on
Okay,
the
so
website.
let's talk. So it is true that if you're using IaaS, infrastructure as a service, on Google, not just Amazon, it's just a virtual machine. It's it's Ubuntu or whatever.
No, I'm talking about services. For example, SimpleDB. You know what SimpleDB is? It still works.
Right. So you're
There's no
saying
documentation at all.
there's ongoing support for old services. Google also maintains ongoing support for many old services. For example, the Google Application Engine APIs are fully supported. When I said you might migrate, it's because you might choose to go with flexible environment. You might use these new APIs. You might want the future in which things are decoupled. Moreover, for new applications, you might use these new APIs. You don't have to leave the old ones. Some things do get deprecated, so that is a reality. And I still claim that when you have less control of your infrastructure, you also have to keep moving. You don't have the choice of using outdated systems. Sometimes you do, but less often you do. So let's talk a bit about dev tools. Now, this is interesting to me. I'm thinking, architecturally, because they had to deal with the same dilemma of what used to be called best of the breed versus out of the box. So earlier, Google provided dev tools. I'm talking about Eclipse that was this nice, convenient little bundle. It's just all in one. And now they're moving in the direction of separate Maven and Eclipse plugins, which of course, together, integrate. Slightly less convenient, but more flexible. So again, it's that same architectural decision, although on a completely different layer. We're talking about development tools here. It's not as mature as Standard Environment, but my team is doing it. And when it comes to emulators, some of you guys have emulators, standalone emulators, such as a data store emulator you can run locally, and some have none, like CloudTest. As I mentioned, that's alpha. So again, the generally available data store API is not an emulator. Although not integrated with the rest of the tool set. A word about Flex versus GKE. Why might you choose Flex and not GKE? It was earlier hinted they might go straight for GCE, but in either case, Flex gives you a lot of stuff out of the box, very familiar, relatively easy, deployment tools, load balancing, and so on. But there's still reasons that you might choose GKE over Flex, particularly for stateful applications. Remember, flexible environment is a PaaS. You can control the shutdowns to make sure there's always an instance or two or however many running, but they will shut it down to either to auto-scale or even with manual scaling, they may update the operating system in a controlled way. But if you have to absolutely have state, an in-memory database, which is the system of reference, like a Postgres cluster, you'll want to go with something like GKE. And as the slogan goes, treat your servers like cattle, not like pets. Servers are not fluffy that you pet. They're a lot full of cattle. They don't have names, they don't have a separate identity. So you have to remember that's true basically in Flex as well. GKE is also useful for a multi-cloud or hybrid cloud system because it is a more portable Docker container that you just, in principle, move around US or to wherever you need to move it. I actually read some articles saying that was Google's strategy. I don't have any specialized knowledge about that, but to make that layer completely portable and not a specialty of any one provider. And GKE is also good if you have even more specialized requirements, like TCP level services. Remember I said Flex was better than Standard Environment if you have specialized requirements, but your requirements might be even more specialized than that. So in conclusion, which layer should you choose? If you have standard requirements, good old-fashioned web app, go with a PaaS. And you can also do that if you're willing to maintain microservice discipline, split up your code, modularize it like you should, go with a PaaS like Standard Environment. Go with Flex as an alternative to Standard Environment when you have an idiosyncratic architecture in which you want the benefits of a PaaS, but you need to use lots of memory, long processing time, slow initialization, a long lifetime, or different languages, like different versions of Go, Node.js, and so on. Ruby, many more. And even if your application today does not need those things, if your company is a technical differentiator, then you may find yourself here. Only you can foresee the future of your company. But if right now you have a standard web app, and in the future you're going to do unusual things, you may end up in this place where you have a standard environment app, and then you think, do I need to move this to flexible environment? The two can run next to each other, but if you do that, then I suggest that from day one you develop using APIs that work in both systems, the cloud APIs. And if you're considering GKE, just give a thought to Flex. It's still Docker, but they reduce the ops load as compared to using GKE. There are actually other ways of running Docker. There's an article I found about that talks about 4 ways of doing it. Ultimately, you can just run your own Dockers on GCE, and Google also provides managed instances. Flex is you might call it their fourth Docker technology. The layers are multiplying. The cloud providers are experimenting, as I mentioned in the middle of my talk, constantly and rapidly developing brand new layers that are no longer old-fashioned PaaS and IaaS. Choose the right layer. The decision will stay with you for many years. It's one of the most important decisions you can make. And now I'd like to hand it over to you for questions. So, questions, anyone?
I already asked a lot that I can ask.
Please do. I love talking about this stuff. Anyone have a question?
We need to get our hands dirty, so we have more questions. This was just intro to it.
It was. So I don't know how much experience everyone has here talking about getting your hands dirty. There are very few people here with 15 years experience in cloud systems. Anyway.
Yeah, but there's someone with 11 years in cloud, like me. So.
There you go. So the point I'm making is that most of us, at least, have to start somewhere. And there's a temptation to do one of two things, because I've seen this. Either you say, I just got a web app, I'm going to throw it on, Roku or Google Application Standard Environment. It's just easy. It is easy, That's one way, as somebody who's not experienced in the whole cloud world. The other decision says, which is again a decision for beginners, says, I don't understand this stuff, but I know Ubuntu. I'll just throw up an Ubuntu virtual machine and then leave me alone, I know how to play around in there. So that's a yes decision. In each case you regret it, you always regret everything. When you choose a PaaS and you start developing, you realize that it constrains you. You choose a yes and you start developing and you say, wait a minute, why am I managing database connections here or scaling? I don't need to do this. So for people who are new to this, they often find themselves between one of those two decisions. If you go with Flex, you're still faced with those decisions. But you should appreciate that there's a way to get into it that maybe doesn't constrain you as much as a standard environment, but doesn't require you to mess around with the low level the way you would with GCP. Okay, yes, another question?
Can you describe from the title of the talk, I thought that it will be more about actually flexible environment and not about decision what you should like to choose flexible environment. Because for me it's clear when to recommend to somebody when to choose flexible environment if the person makes his own trade-off between DevOps, investing in DevOps, or give more power to developers or etc.
So what
can you
have
describe actually your experience in using flexible environments and what the problems you encountered?
Okay, so the question is, about flexible environment itself. So I purposely didn't want to, when you develop a flexible environment, you're developing always some sort of HTTP server. It's still HTTP, but as I say, it might be more than a simple web server. They're just, easily a simple CRUD server. So in terms of code, you've got your servlet, and it's responding to requests, and you write it in Java, and it connects to the database, and so on. I don't think there's anything sort of unusual about that. On the level of problems, as I mentioned, this just came out of beta, and we have Freightos, or pioneers, is incredible. That's both exhilarating and scary, because we encountered a lot of the bugs as it went through the pre-release stages. Much of it has been released and it's a lot more stable now. I don't know if it's interesting to talk about any one specific bug, But if you use the GA parts, then it works pretty robustly. What's the question specifically?
I have two more specific questions.
Yes.
The first one, can you compare the developer experience working with Flex Env versus Heroku or Elastic Beanstalk
Yes.
on Amazon?
Yes.
And the second question, I forgot it.
Okay, so the question is, what is your developer experience in Flex as opposed to any other PaaS, which would include Elastic Beanstalk, Amazon, or Heroku, or, of course, Google Application Engine Standard Environment. And as you get started, it's just as easy as any other PaaS, which is, again, it's value add as compared to GKE. It's all set out for you. You write a servlet, you stick it into some standard development tool, and just launch it. The servlet is auto launch for you. You don't have to worry about SSL certificates and the load balancing and stuff like that. So that's the selling point, why it's easier. Now it is maybe a little harder.
Easier than, again,
No, easier than
compare
IaaS.
with its own asset class. Heroku, AWS Elastic Beanstalk, Google Appended Flexible Environments.
You're asking if they're equally easy.
Yeah.
They're pretty much equally easy, except for the fact that Flex is new, and therefore some components are not generally available. So Alpha is always harder to use. But if you stick with the GA components, then it's just as easy. The only part I can say that would be specifically harder is, as I said, the development tools are not yet fully integrated, but they exist. We use them in my team. A little bit more fiddling around to get them to work, but they're usable. Other than that, it's just like any other PaaS, but more flexible.
So, again, I wouldn't use the word fast, but on AWS,
Yes.
the person who knows CloudFormation well, who knows about the auto-scaling groups, who knows how to use Elastic Beanstalk,
Yes.
can have like a short CloudFormation template without everything Elastic Beanstalk does.
Okay.
I guess it's the same on Google Cloud Platform. If you know
Yes.
Cloud Deployment Manager or if you know
Yes.
Terraform, you can build a script that does everything flexible
Yes.
Elastic does with JKE or without JKE.
Sure. Yes.
So the trade-off here is about learning
Yes.
and having DevOps skills. and
Exactly.
choice, right?
It's exactly what learning in DevOps skills, as you correctly point out. You can do anything in a Turing complete system. Just kidding, but you can do anything.
CloudFormation is not truly complete and Terraform is not truly complete on
I'm just
purpose.
saying, you can always get the same functionality out of anything. And when you have the templates, as you said, and you know what you're doing, you can get everything that exists in Flex out of GKE or GCE. Again, it's all just jetting, load balancers, these things exist. And if you're an expert at deployment, as you say, maybe you're not an expert, whatever level of learning it is, but you can launch all these things in any system, absolutely. The average developer, if you ask, what's easiest for somebody who's just getting into it, I would still say Google Application Engine, Elastic Beanstalk, Heroku are easier than learning those other things. Hypothetically, Flex is just longer. So you can do it, you absolutely can do it. It's a trade-off, that's all.
Did you try WebSockets or any long-living connections with FlexVM, FlexEnv?
We did not do that, but its special benefit is that you can run the threads as long as you want. And we have done HTTP requests that have lasted ridiculous amounts of time. It's not part of our core flow, but I don't know. Things happen where it can last hours and hours. So it does support that, as opposed to Standard Environment, which doesn't. But again, there's a price you pay, well, actually literally in terms of money, right? The beauty of auto-scaling is that you only spend as much money as you need in something Standard Environment. It spins instances up and down, whereas in Flex, yes, it can spin instances up and down, but not as, let's say, fast and conveniently as Standard Environment.
What's your risk management plan for rewriting your application? Because I don't know, GA, Google have to give a 1 year notice if they changing or deprecating stuff. So
it's an issue with Google deprecating things. Now, if you're not already in the system, this doesn't concern you. You can just work with the generally available APIs. But as you correctly asked about migration, there's a question of what happens when Google deprecates, and you've got to get off of a system before they shut it down. So that's an issue. Yeah, we absolutely need to do that.
Do you have a year or?
Well, that's up for discussion. I don't know the exact amount of time that Google officially offers. If I was,
No, I think they described the whole for alpha it's such and such, for beta it's such
Yeah,
and
but
such, for GA.
it's never enough time, because the truth is that there's different timelines for different types of software. If you got a lightweight little web app, maybe it's fast to migrate. When you have large-scale systems with lots of dependencies and sadly imperfect code, but that's life, then it can take longer to migrate. So those amounts of time you're talking about are, of course, very important, very critical, but very important questions. And I guess you'd have to ask Google for the answers there, yeah. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Can you speak about the microservices in the Flex environments?
So Flex is absolutely intended for microservices. First of all, Google has something in their system called services, which is microservices exactly. And it works like this. You have an instance, right? It's just like a Jetty server. In our case, it's a Docker, as I said, VM. In the case of Google Application Engine, it's the sandbox. So let's call that an instance. And then as you auto-scale, you might have more than one. You might have 100, whatever it takes to meet traffic. Those together are called a version, okay? Now you might have more than one version, because as I said, version 1, version 2. Version 2 is a release canary, which means you try it out before you're always ready to roll back to version 1. So that's called a version. And then these are still versions of the same thing, like the versions of your backend, versions of your front end, that sort of thing. And then the higher level is called services. So you've got you may have a back-end service, a front-end service, a computing service, or whatever it is that your system is doing, authorization service, whatever it is that you need for your microservices. So to answer your question, this is all built around the concept of services, which are really like microservices. And Google makes it pretty convenient for one microservice to call another. So there's an API that says, give me the internal IP address, or internal, even a host name of the other service, so that they can talk to each other. So yes, it is built around that. That's not special to Flex. That's also true in Standard Environment. So question?
Yeah, what
Yes,
are the
please.
constraints using the Flex as opposed to, let's say, what languages you could use or any APIs?
Yeah. So the question
In
is,
Standard Environment, I know we have constraints for that. So
yes, the question is what constraints are there in Flex? So there's a lot fewer constraints. Really, it's just a Docker container, and as long as it meets the assumptions going down and going up, then here we go.
yeah, but what are those going down and going up?
Yeah, so going up, what I mean by that is it exposes certain URLs, and Google will call those URLs to say, start up please, or I'm about to shut you down, or whatever it is, Google talks through those URLs. So that's facing outwards towards the network. On the lower level, you have to construct in a certain way so that the Docker will initialize. But as long as you do that, you can in principle create your own Docker containers in weird languages like Perl. I wouldn't do it myself, and if I'm going to make that effort of writing in Swift or Perl, I would just say I'm going to remember the whole point I made about PaaS. Only go with the PaaS when you can live within its assumptions. Don't push the assumptions. Don't push your limits. This is just my opinion. I wouldn't play games with the limits. Can you write a Docker container in Perl? Google has informed me that it's possible, but I would stick with the prepackaged Dockers, which include a much greater variety than Standard Environment does, because for them it was easier to put together these Docker containers than to build new sandboxes, which have to be highly customized. So these are some languages that are supported in these Docker containers. Yeah, another question?
The comment, I guess the problem is not with the Docker itself,
Yes.
but with having client libraries or bindings for Google App Engine or Google Cloud Platform.
You're saying
In your specific
bindings.
language,
Excellent point. I actually don't know the answer to that question. If I wanted to invoke some of those cloud or client APIs using Perl, how would I do it? Well, I actually know one answer, which is I would use the raw RPC URLs, post, get. I'm personally, I'm just a plain old software engineer. I would not dare do that, but it's certainly feasible as such. They've wrapped, people at Google have wrapped these RPCs in certain languages.
No,
including
that's
Python,
also a problem
Java.
because gRPC is fairly new. It's
Yes.
based on protocol buffers, but it's new.
Okay.
And you don't have a lot of bindings for gRPC, so you're like stuck.
So I'm basically agreeing with you that this is just, it may be fun, but I personally, I'm not talking as a Google, right? These things may be possible, they may be good. I'm just saying what I personally would do is what you're saying with the bindings and so on. I wouldn't go with Perl or whatever it is. But it does help you understand what's going on. It helps you understand that this is really, in the end, just a Docker container. Yeah, so another question. Okay, this is your chance to live in a flexible environment. But, happy to talk to you, and here's my email. So thank you very much, everybody.
שירה, רגע.
שיעזור לו. יש לו?
תלחץ על הרסט API. שמחה, כיף.
Again, as I say, don't push the buttons. So I would say, so in Standard Environment, you only have to
יום יום. כן, הוא סיפר לי.
אז הייתי בסטנדרט אנווירנמנט, the Flex.
אבל החבר שלך...
איפה הכפתורים פה?
קרפת עליי.
אתה גם לא מצליח? לא, אתם ילדים. בואו, תנו לי, אני אעשה. לא, הם לא יודעים לעצור אותו.
יש פה לחצן.
לא, אל תראה להם, אל תראה, לא, אל תראה.